He was 18 years old, and he was leaving the only home he'd ever truly known. The catch was, it had never been a home at all. They called it a group home, a residential facility, a youth transition center. He called it the end of the line. For a young man who inherited 400 acres of Montana wilderness and $250,000, this bus ride felt less like a beginning and more like the same old story. What he didn't know was that the will proving his ownership was buried somewhere on that land, put there by the same aunt who had signed the papers that sent him away. What he would discover there would change not just his future, but the entire story of his past. If you've ever felt like you were fighting for a life that was stolen from you before you even had a chance to live it, then hit that subscribe button, because the story is for you. The bus engine groaned, a low, tired sound that vibrated through the cracked vinyl of my seat and up into my bones. I was officially an adult. Teen. The word felt hollow, like a cheap chocolate Easter bunny you crack open to find nothing inside. For 2 years, I'd been counting down the days to this one. Freedom. Now that it was here, it just felt like a different kind of cage, one with wheels and a long gray road stretching out in front of it. In my lap was a worn duffel bag containing everything I owned. 3 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book I'd read a dozen times, and a small state-issued check for $250. My severance package from the system. Tucked inside the book was the only thing that truly mattered. A creased, yellowed envelope. My Uncle Ben's last letter. He'd been dead for 10 years, but the letter had only arrived this morning, handed to me by the facility director with a shrug that said, "Don't ask me, the postmark was from a decade ago." It had been sent to a P.O. box with instructions to be held and delivered on my 18th birthday. It was the last ghost of a life I could barely remember. I remembered his smile, the rough feel of his flannel shirts, and the smell of sawdust and pine that always clung to him. He was the only warmth in the cold, fractured memories of my childhood. My parents were hazy figures, gone in a flash of twisted metal and shattering glass on a snowy road when I was 6. After that, there was only my Aunt Carol. Her face was a permanent mask of strained politeness, her hands always cold. She was the one who drove me to the first home, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She never looked at me, not once. She said it was for the best, that she couldn't handle a child, that I'd be better off with professionals. Over the years, that story hardened inside me, turning from confusion to a cold, hard stone of resentment. She had abandoned me. It was the one truth I held on to. I carefully opened the letter, my fingers tracing the familiar, looping handwriting. Felt like touching a ghost. "My dearest Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am long gone, and you are finally a man. I am sorry I couldn't be there to see it. I am sorry for so much. I know you must have questions. I know you must carry a heavy heart. There are things you do not understand about why your life went the way it did. Things I couldn't explain before. Your Aunt Carol. She is not what you think. She made a choice, a terrible one, but she did it to protect you. I hope one day you can find it in your heart to understand. If not forgive." The words swam in front of my eyes. Protect me? From what? She was the one who threw me away. The letter continued. "Everything I had is now yours, Leo. The ranch, the 400 acres of Montana soil that has been in our family for a century. The money I saved, it's all yours. But I had to hide it. I had to make sure it would be safe until you were old enough and strong enough to claim it. The will is buried. Your aunt knows where, but I fear she may be too afraid to tell you. So I am leaving you a map, a key." A starting point below the text was a set of hand-drawn coordinates and a small, ornate brass key, taped securely to the paper. The key was heavy, old-fashioned. A skeleton key. "The key opens the front door of the house. The coordinates will lead you to the rest. Be careful, son. The land holds more than just memories. There are shadows there, long ones, and the people who cast them have not gone away. This is your birthright, Leo. Fight for it. Don't let them take anything else from you. All my love, Uncle Ben." I folded the letter, my hands trembling slightly. 400 acres. $250,000. It was an impossible dream, a fairy tale. And yet, the key felt real in my palm. The coordinates were just numbers on a page. But they pointed somewhere. They pointed home. The bus lurched, pulling me from my thoughts. We were leaving the city limits, the gray concrete and smog giving way to the sprawling, indifferent suburbs. I looked out the window, at the rows of identical houses, each with its perfect lawn and two-car garage. I had spent my life on the outside looking in, a ward of the state, a file in a cabinet. Now, this letter was telling me I belonged somewhere, that I had roots. But it also spoke of shadows, of danger, of a fight. And it asked me to reconsider the one thing I was sure of, my aunt's betrayal. The weight of it all settled on me, heavier than the duffel bag in my lap. This wasn't just about money or land. This was about the truth, my truth. And the only way to find it was to follow a dead man's map into the heart of a past I had tried so hard to forget. The bus ride was 22 hours long. A slow crawl across state lines, through endless stretches of farmland and forgotten towns. With every mile, the world outside the window grew wider, emptier. The sky seemed to get bigger, a vast, pale blue canvas that dwarfed everything beneath it. I watched the cities shrink into towns, the towns into specks on the horizon. The other passengers were ghosts, their faces blurred by exhaustion and the dim, flickering lights of the bus. I felt utterly alone, suspended between a past I didn't understand and a future that felt like a terrifying, blank page. I slept in fits and starts, my head resting against the cold glass of the window. In my dreams, I saw my uncle's face, not smiling, but worried. He was pointing at something in the distance, something I couldn't see. I would wake with a start, my heart pounding, the key clutched in my hand. The $250 from the state felt like a joke. It was enough for the bus ticket and maybe a week's worth of cheap motel rooms and greasy diner food. After that, I would be destitute. This inheritance, this hidden will, wasn't just a chance at a better life. It was my only chance. Failure wasn't an option. Failure meant shelters, soup kitchens, the streets. It meant becoming another statistic, another kid aged out of the system with nowhere to go. I had seen it happen to others. I wouldn't let it happen to me. As we crossed into Montana, the landscape transformed. The flat plains rose into rolling hills, then into jagged, snow-capped mountains that clawed at the sky. The sheer scale of it was intimidating. It was beautiful, but it was a harsh, unforgiving beauty. This was where I was from. This wild, empty place was in my blood. The thought didn't comfort me. It made me feel even smaller, even more out of place. Finally, after an eternity, the bus driver called out a name I recognized from the return address on the envelope. Willow Creek. Next stop, Willow Creek. My stomach twisted into a knot. I gathered my duffel bag, my hands slick with sweat. The bus hissed to a stop in front of a single building that served as the town station, post office, and general store. I stepped off the bus and into another world. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was so quiet I could hear the rustle of leaves in the trees a block away. The town itself was little more than one main street, lined with old brick buildings with faded signs. A diner, a hardware store, a bar, and not much else. A few people on the street stopped and stared as I stood there. A city kid with a duffel bag and a lost look on his face. Their gazes weren't hostile, just curious. In a town this small, a new face was an event. I knew I had to walk. The ranch was another 5 miles out, according to a weathered map I'd studied at the last rest stop. I shifted the bag on my shoulder and started walking, following the main road as it wound its way out of town. The silence was unnerving. In the group home, there was always noise, the drone of a television, the shouting of other boys, the jangling keys of the staff. Out here, the only sounds were my own footsteps on the gravel shoulder and the cry of a distant hawk. The road climbed steadily, and the houses grew farther and farther apart until there were none at all, just endless fences marking the edges of unseen properties. After what felt like hours, I saw it. A rusted, wrought iron gate, flanked by 2 stone pillars. Between the bars, I could make out a faded wooden sign, half swallowed by ivy. Blackwood Ranch, no, that wasn't right. Someone had crudely painted over the original name. I could just make out the older letters underneath. Miller Ranch, my family's name. My ranch. A heavy chain was wrapped around the gate, secured with a massive, modern padlock. My heart sank. Of course, it wouldn't be that easy. I walked the fence line, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The fence was old but sturdy. Barbed wire stretched between weathered wooden posts. It went on and on. This was just a tiny fraction of 400 acres. The scale of it was hard to comprehend. I finally found a spot where the lower wire was loose. I dropped my bag, got on my stomach, and shimmied under, the barbs snagging my jacket. I was trespassing on my own property. The irony was not lost on me. The driveway was a ghost of what it once must have been. 2 dirt tracks, now almost completely overgrown with weeds and tall grass. It wound through a stand of aspen trees, their white bark like silent sentinels. As I walked, the sense of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the curious stares of the townspeople. This was different. It was the feeling of the land itself, old and powerful, observing me. After a 10-minute walk, the trees cleared, and I saw the house. It stood on a small rise, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide, wraparound porch. The paint was peeling, the roof was sagging in one spot, and several windows were boarded up. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But it also looked strong, defiant, like an old boxer who refused to go down. It was the first real home I had ever seen that was supposed to be mine. I walked up the rickety porch steps, which groaned in protest under my weight. The front door was solid oak, bleached gray by the sun and wind. In the center was an old, ornate lock, the brass tarnished with age. I pulled out the key from my uncle's letter. My hand was shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get it into the lock. I held my breath and turned. There was a loud, grating click, a sound that echoed in the profound silence. The door swung inward on creaking hinges, opening into darkness. I stepped across the threshold, and the world outside seemed to fall away. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the scent of dust, old wood, and something else, something familiar. Pine needles and wood smoke. The smell of my uncle. My eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. I was standing in a large living room. Most of the furniture was gone, but the outlines in the dust showed where a sofa, chairs, and tables had once stood. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and black. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows in dusty shafts, illuminating dancing motes of dust. It was an empty house, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud. I ran my hand along the dusty mantelpiece. This was real. I was here. This was mine. But the letter had said the will was buried. I had to find the coordinates. I spent the next hour exploring the house. The kitchen was a time capsule from another era, with a huge cast-iron stove and faded floral wallpaper. Upstairs, the bedrooms were bare, stripped of everything personal. In one room, a small rocking horse sat alone in the center of the floor, its paint chipped, one of its rockers broken. A sudden, sharp memory pierced through the fog of my childhood. My father's laughter as he pushed me on this very horse. The memory was so vivid, so painful, that I had to lean against the doorframe to catch my breath. The grief was a physical thing, a punch to the gut. This house wasn't just a building. It was a mausoleum of a life I'd lost. In what must have been my uncle's office, I found what I was looking for. A large wooden desk sat against one wall. The drawers were empty, but tacked to a corkboard above it was a large topographical map of the property. It was covered in my uncle's familiar handwriting, with notes about fence lines, springs, and grazing pastures. And there, on a prominent hill in the northern section of the property, was a small, circled X. The coordinates from the letter matched perfectly. The spot was marked with a simple, hand-drawn sketch of a large oak tree. I had my map. Now I just needed to get there. I grabbed an old, rusty shovel I'd seen on the back porch and a canteen I filled from a creaking hand pump in the kitchen. The water tasted of iron and earth. It was the best water I'd ever had. Leaving the house, I set off across the land, using the map and the position of the sun to guide me. The scale of the property was staggering. I walked through fields of tall, dry grass that whispered in the wind, their golden heads bowing in unison. I crossed a shallow, fast-moving creek, the water so clear I could count the stones on the bottom. The land rolled and dipped, a living, breathing thing beneath my feet. This was my inheritance. Not just the deed or the title, but the wind, the sky, the silence. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of belonging, a fragile connection to this place. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. After nearly an hour of hiking, I saw it. A single massive oak tree standing alone on the crest of a hill, its gnarled branches reaching for the sky like twisted arms. It was exactly as my uncle had drawn it. My heart pounded in my chest. I was close. I scrambled up the last few feet of the hill, my lungs burning. The view from the top was breathtaking. The entire valley stretched out below me, a patchwork of greens and golds, with the distant mountains forming a jagged blue line on the horizon. My land, our land. I walked to the base of the great oak. Its trunk was thick and ancient, its bark a roadmap of deep fissures. And there, on the west side, just as the letter had implied, the ground was different. The grass was patchier, the soil looser, as if it had been disturbed and then replaced. I took a deep breath, gripped the shovel, and plunged it into the earth. The digging was hard work. The soil was rocky and dense. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. My hands, soft from years of indoor life, quickly blistered. But I didn't stop. With every shovelful of dirt, I felt like I was digging up not just a box, but my own past, my own identity. After 20 minutes of frantic work, the shovel hit something hard with a dull, metallic thud. My breath caught in my throat. I dropped to my knees and clawed at the dirt with my bare hands, ignoring the sting of the blisters. Slowly, I uncovered the top of a dark green, metal box. It was an old military-style footlocker, sealed with 2 heavy latches. Took all my strength to haul it out of the hole. It was heavy, much heavier than a few documents should be. I fumbled with the latches, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. They were stiff with rust, but finally, they gave way with a groan. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on top of a thick stack of yellowed envelopes, was a legal-looking document tied with a faded red ribbon. The last will and testament of Benjamin Miller. I lifted it out, my hands shaking. It was real. Everything he'd said was real. Beneath the will were the letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me in his familiar script. And under the letters was something else. Stacks of cash, wrapped in thick rubber bands. I counted it quickly. $10,000. For immediate needs, a small note attached to the top bundle read, "It was a fortune. It was survival." But it was the letters that held the real treasure, the real weight. I picked up the one on top, which was much thicker than the others. A date was written on the corner. The day after he had sent the original letter to the P.O. box. This was the explanation. This was the truth. I sat down with my back against the ancient oak, the valley sprawling before me, and I began to read. "Leo," the letter started. "If you found this, you are standing on Miller land, and you have the will in your hands. I hope you took a moment to look out at the valley. It's all yours now. But ownership is a burden, son, and I am sorry for the one I am about to lay on you. You need to understand about your Aunt Carol. You have spent your life believing she abandoned you. She didn't. She saved you." The next few paragraphs laid out a story so different from my own that it felt like reading fiction. My parents, he explained, weren't just ranchers. My father had been a fierce opponent of a massive land development corporation called Blackwood Development. They had been trying to buy up all the land in the valley for years, not for houses, but for the water rights. Our ranch had the most significant aquifer in the region. My father had organized the local ranchers, fought them at town meetings, filed legal challenges. He was a thorn in their side. And Blackwood, run by a ruthless and powerful man named Marcus Thorne, did not tolerate thorns. The car accident, my uncle wrote, was no accident. The police had ruled it as such, a patch of black ice, a tragic loss of control. But my uncle had found things. A witness who was scared into silence. Evidence that the brake lines on my parents' truck had been tampered with. He had no proof that would stand up in court, but he knew. Thorne had them killed. After their deaths, Thorne came for the ranch. He came for me. I was the heir. He pressured Carol, the only remaining family, to sell. He threatened her. He made it clear that what happened to my parents could happen to a little boy, too. She was terrified, alone, and grieving, so she made a devil's bargain. She would place me in the state system where I would be lost, just another number on a spreadsheet, untraceable to Thorne and his organization. In exchange, he would leave the ranch alone, paying the property taxes through a shell company to avoid suspicion, until I turned 18. He agreed, likely assuming that a boy raised by the system would be broken, eager to sell his birthright for a quick payday. Carol had to play the part of the cold, uncaring aunt. She had to sever all ties, make me believe she wanted nothing to do with me, all to keep me off Blackwood's radar. She had sacrificed her reputation, her family, her peace of mind, all to keep me alive. The words blurred as tears streamed down my face. I cried for the parents I barely knew, murdered for their principles. I cried for the uncle who had spent the last years of his life trying to protect their legacy. But most of all, I cried for my aunt. For the years I had spent hating her, nurturing that cold stone of resentment in my heart, when all along, she had been my silent, suffering guardian. The weight of her sacrifice was crushing. The letter wasn't finished. So now you have a choice, Leo, it read. It's the hardest choice a man can make. In this box is $10,000 in cash. You can take it, walk away from this valley, and never look back. Disappear. Start a new life somewhere else. A life of peace and anonymity. No one would blame you. I wouldn't blame you. Or you can stay. You can file this will. You can claim your inheritance. And you can fight. If you choose to fight, know that you will be fighting the same monster that took your parents. Thorne is still here. Blackwood is more powerful than ever. They will come for you. They will try to break you. But you are a miller. And millers don't break. I looked from the letter to the stacks of cash, then back out at the valley. The sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains in hues of orange and purple. This land, this beautiful, dangerous land, was soaked in my family's blood and sacrifice. To walk away would be to let them win. To let my parents' deaths, my uncle's lonely struggle, and my aunt's agonizing choice all be for nothing. The fear was a living thing inside me, a cold serpent coiling in my gut. But for the first time, something else was there, too. A flicker of anger, a spark of pride. I am a miller. My uncle's words echoed in my mind. For my entire life, I had been a ward of the state, a number, a problem to be managed. Here, on this hill, holding my family's history in my hands, I was someone else. I was the heir. I was the one they were afraid of. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was a calling. Listen, if you've made it this far, you know what a choice like this feels like. Maybe not with a ranch and a hidden will, but with your own life. That moment when everything you thought was true turns out to be a lie, a story told to protect you, and you're left standing at a crossroads. One path leads to safety, to letting go, to moving on. The other path leads right back into the fire, to fight for the truth, to reclaim what's yours, no matter the cost. What do? Do you run, or do you stand your ground? Let me know in the comments what you would have chosen. Because my choice changed everything. It set in motion a chain of events that would unearth secrets even my uncle never knew. Now, let's get back to the story. I spent the night in the old house, not sleeping, but reading. I read every letter my uncle had written, one for each year I was away. They were a chronicle of his loneliness, his love for me, and his quiet, dogged investigation into Blackwood development. He detailed every suspicious land deal, every strong-armed negotiation, every politician in Marcus Thorne's pocket. He had been building a case from the shadows for a decade. The letters were filled with stories of my parents, of his life on the ranch, of the history of our family. He was giving me back the childhood that had been stolen from me, one page at a time. By the time the sun rose, casting long shadows across the dusty floor, I was a different person. The scared, resentful boy who had gotten off that bus was gone. In his place was a young man with a purpose, fueled by a righteous anger and a deep, aching love for the family he had only just begun to truly know. My first step was clear. I had to find Aunt Carol. I had to look her in the eye, not with hatred, but with the understanding I now possessed. I had to let her know that her sacrifice had not been in vain. I packed the will, the letters, and the cash back into my duffel bag. I buried the empty footlocker back under the oak tree, smoothing the dirt over it as best I could. No need to leave any signs of my discovery. I walked back into Willow Creek, the morning air cool and fresh. The town was slowly coming to life. A bakery was opening, its warm, yeasty smell filling the street. An old man was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the hardware store. I felt like I was seeing it all for the first time, not as an outsider, but as a part of it. This was my town. These were my people, whether they knew it yet or not. I went into the general store, the same place the bus had dropped me off. A bell above the door chimed. An older woman with kind eyes and a cloud of white hair looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked. "I'm looking for someone," I said, my voice hoarse. "Carol Miller. I'm her nephew." The woman's eyes widened slightly. She knew the name. Of course she did. "Carol?" she said softly, a hint of pity in her voice. "Poor thing. Hasn't had an easy go of it. She lives in the old foreman's cottage, out at the edge of the Miller property. Sold her own place in town years ago to keep up with the taxes on the ranch. Said she had to keep it safe for when the time was right." The woman's words were another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation of Carol's silent, lonely vigil. She pointed me down a side road I hadn't noticed before. "It's about a mile that way. Small blue house. Can't miss it." I thanked her and left, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was going to be harder than digging for treasure. This was digging into a wound that was 12 years old. The cottage was small and simple, with a tidy little garden out front. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. She was home. I walked up the short path and knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was no answer. I was about to knock again when the door opened a crack. A woman's face, etched with lines of worry and fatigue, peered out at me. It was her, Aunt Carol. She was older, grayer, but I recognized her instantly. Her eyes, the same pale blue as my mother's, widened in shock and then, unmistakably, in fear. "Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here." "I know everything," I said, my own voice softer than I intended. "Uncle Ben left me a letter. He told me everything." I held up the thick envelope I had taken from the box. Her eyes fixated on it, and all the color drained from her face. She sagged against the doorframe, a wave of relief and terror washing over her at the same time. "Oh, Ben," she breathed. "You old fool. You promised." She opened the door wider and let me in. The inside of the cottage was cozy and cluttered, filled with books and knitting baskets. We sat at her small kitchen table in silence for a long time. I pushed the letter across the table to her. She didn't read it. She didn't have to. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes filled with a decade of unshed tears. "He's going to know you're here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Marcus Thorne. He has eyes and ears everywhere in this valley. The moment that bus stopped, he knew. Let him know," I said, the anger rising in me again. "I'm not a scared little boy anymore, Aunt Carol. I'm not running." She finally broke. The sobs racked her body, deep, painful sounds of grief and guilt held in for 12 years. I did something I never thought I would do. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was cold, just like I remembered. But this time, I held on, trying to pour some of my newfound strength into her. When she finally composed herself, she told me the rest of the story. How Thorne had tormented her, his polite, veiled threats a constant presence in her life. How the townspeople, many of whom worked for Blackwood or owed Thorne money, had slowly turned their backs on her, treating her like a pariah. She had lived in isolation, her only purpose to keep the ranch from falling into his hands. Ben knew this day would come, she said, her voice stronger now. He made preparations. There's a lawyer, the only one in the state he trusted. His name is Elias Vance. He's in Helena. He's old now, semi-retired, but he knows the whole story. He was Ben's closest friend. He helped Ben set up the trust for you. She wrote down a name and an address on a slip of paper. You have to go see him, Leo. Show him the will, the letters. He'll know what to do. She looked at me, a flicker of her old fear returning. But you have to be careful. Thorn is not a man to be underestimated. He's a pillar of the community on the surface, but underneath he's a snake. I nodded. I will be before I left. She stopped me at the door. Leo, can you ever forgive me? She asked, her voice breaking. I looked into her tired, hopeful eyes. There's nothing to forgive, Aunt Carol, I said, and for the first time I meant it. You saved my life. The bus ride to Helena felt different. I wasn't running from a past I didn't understand anymore. I was moving toward a future I was determined to claim. I found Elias Vance's office in a historic downtown building. The plaque on the door was old brass, his name engraved in elegant script. I expected a stuffy, corporate office, but when I stepped inside, I found a room that looked more like a university professor's library. Bookshelves overflowed, stacks of paper covered every surface, and the air smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco. A man who must have been well into his 70s sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He had a shock of white hair, a sharply intelligent face, and eyes that seemed to see right through me. You must be Leo Miller, he said, his voice a low, calm baritone. He hadn't seemed surprised to see me. Your aunt called, said you were coming, said you'd found Ben's legacy. I sat down in the worn leather chair opposite him and pulled the will and the letters from my bag. I laid them on his desk. He picked up the will first, his long, practiced fingers untying the ribbon. He read it carefully, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up the first of my uncle's letters, the one explaining everything. He read that, too, his jaw tightening slightly as he did. When he was finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, looking at me over the top of them. Your uncle was a good man, he said, stubborn as a mule and twice as smart. He knew this was a long game. He spent the last 10 years of his life preparing for this day. For you, he paused, his gaze intense. Filing this will is like firing a starter pistol, you understand? Marcus Thorne will know about it within hours. His lawyers will descend on this like vultures. They'll contest the will's validity. They'll claim your uncle was not of sound mind. They'll try to paint you as an opportunist, a delinquent kid from the system trying to cash in. They will drag you, your aunt, and your family's name through the mud. I don't care, I said, my voice steady. Good, Vance said, a small, grim smile touching his lips. That's what your father would have said. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Because what Thorne doesn't know is that your uncle didn't just leave you letters and a will. He left you a weapon. He spent years gathering evidence of Blackwood's crimes. Extortion, illegal dumping of industrial waste into the river, bribery of county officials, and evidence related to your parents' accident. He could never find a smoking gun, but he found enough to light a fire that could burn Thorne's whole empire to the ground. My breath caught. Where is it? This evidence. Ben was cagey, even with me, Vance admitted. He told me he hid it somewhere on the ranch, somewhere safe. He said there was a clue for you in the last letter he wrote. A final test, I suppose, to make sure you were worthy of the fight. We looked through the stack of letters until we found the very last one, dated just a week before he died. It was short, almost a poem. Where the iron sings and the sparks fly, where a father's hands taught a son to build. Look beneath the floor where the old ghosts lie. The truth is forged where the steel was milled. I read it over and over. The iron sings, sparks fly. The old workshop, I breathed. The blacksmith shop. My grandfather was a blacksmith, and my dad and uncle learned from him. They fixed all their own equipment. Vance nodded slowly. It makes sense. Place of creation. Of strength. I knew I had to go back. I thanked Vance, who promised to begin preparing the preliminary legal paperwork. He would wait for my call. The journey back to Willow Creek was filled with a nervous, electric energy. The final piece of the puzzle was within reach. I went straight to my aunt's cottage and told her what Vance had said. Her face went pale when I mentioned the evidence. "The old workshop," she said. "Leo, it's been abandoned for decades. The floor is half-rotted. It's not safe. I have to look," I insisted. "It's our only real chance." Reluctantly, she agreed to come with me. We walked to the workshop together, a dilapidated wooden structure behind the main barn. The door hung on one hinge. Inside, it was dark and smelled of rust and decay. A huge, silent anvil sat in the center of the room, coated in a thick layer of dust. The forge was cold, its stones crumbling. It was a sad, forgotten place. "Where the old ghosts lie," I murmured, looking at the dusty floorboards. We started searching, tapping each board, looking for anything loose or out of place. It seemed hopeless. The floor was a mess of rotting wood and packed dirt. After an hour of fruitless searching, I was ready to give up. I slumped down on an old workbench, defeated. My hand rested on a section of the wall where old tools were hung on hooks. As I leaned back, my weight pushed a rusty old wrench sideways. There was a faint click. We both froze. Behind the row of tools, a section of the wall, cleverly disguised as a set of shelves, had popped open about an inch. It was a hidden door. My heart leaped into my throat. Behind the door was a small, dark compartment, and inside another metal box, smaller this time. Carol let out a small gasp. We carried it out into the daylight and opened it. There was no money this time. It was filled with documents. A black ledger book, photographs, and a dozen cassette tapes. I opened the ledger. It was my uncle's meticulous record of every payment, every threat, every illegal act he had uncovered. The photos showed tanker trucks dumping waste into the creek upstream from our property, with license plates clearly visible. They showed Marcus Thorne meeting secretly with a county commissioner, who later voted in favor of a zoning change that benefited Blackwood. And the tapes? I found a small, battery-powered cassette player in one of my uncle's old toolboxes. I put one of the tapes in and pressed play. A man's voice, raspy and terrified, filled the air. He was the witness to my parents' accident, the one my uncle had mentioned. He described seeing a Blackwood Company truck force my father's vehicle off the road. He described being visited the next day by Thorne's men, who threatened his family and paid him to keep his mouth shut. My uncle had recorded his confession. It was the smoking gun. We had him. We had it all. Carol and I looked at each other. The box of secrets opened between us. The sun was high in the sky, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt the warmth on my skin. The shadows were still there, but now we had a light to cast them out. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But now we had a chance. Not just to win, but to get justice. For my parents. For my uncle. For my aunt. And for the boy who had been lost for so long and had finally, against all odds, found his way home. The next few weeks were a blur of legal activity. I called Vance from a payphone in town and told him what we'd found. The excitement in his voice was palpable. He drove out to the ranch himself, his old sedan kicking up dust on the overgrown driveway. He spent hours poring over the contents of the box, a grim satisfaction growing on his face with each page he turned, each tape he listened to. "This is it, Leo," he said, looking up at me, his eyes blazing with a fire I hadn't seen before. "This is more than a probate case. This is a criminal conspiracy. This is racketeering. This is wrongful death." He laid out the plan. We would file the will to establish my legal standing as the heir and owner of the ranch. The moment Blackwood's lawyers filed their challenge, we would countersue, using the evidence from the box. Simultaneously, he would leak copies of the most damning evidence, the tapes, the photos of the illegal dumping, to a trusted investigative journalist at the state's largest newspaper. We wouldn't just fight Thorne in court. We would fight him in the court of public opinion. It was a bold, aggressive strategy. It was exactly what my father would have done. Aunt Carol and I worked side by side, preparing the house. We scrubbed away years of dust and neglect, airing out the rooms, letting the sunlight back in. With each clean window and swept floor, it felt like we were not just cleaning a house, but reclaiming our lives. We worked in a comfortable silence, the years of pain and misunderstanding slowly melting away, replaced by a shared purpose. The $10,000 from my uncle was a lifeline. We used it to buy supplies, to pay for the initial legal filing fees, and to get the old well pump working again. For the first time, I felt the security of having money, not as a luxury, but as a tool for survival, a shield. The day Vance filed the will, the quiet war began. Just as he predicted, within 48 hours, a team of expensive-looking lawyers from a big city firm filed a motion to contest. They claimed my uncle had been mentally incompetent, manipulated by my aunt, and that the will was a forgery. They offered me a settlement, $50,000 to walk away and renounce all claims to the property. I looked at the offer, printed on thick, creamy paper, and laughed. I wrote a single word across it in black marker. No. Then the threats started. They were subtle at first. A Blackwood truck parked at the end of our driveway for hours at a time. A late-night phone call to Carol's cottage with no one on the other end. Then they escalated. Someone cut a section of our fence, letting a dozen of the neighbors' cattle wander onto our land. A dead hawk, a symbol of bad luck, was left on our porch. The town turned colder. People who had started to smile at me in the general store now averted their eyes. They were scared. Thorne's power ran deep, but something had changed in me. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. Every act of intimidation only hardened my resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was for every other family in this valley that Thorne had bullied and cheated. Then the newspaper article hit. It was a front-page exposé, complete with photos of the illegal dumping and transcripts from the witness tape. The headline was explosive. Blackwood development linked to environmental crimes. Decades-old suspicious death. The story spread like wildfire. State environmental agencies launched an immediate investigation. The district attorney's office, under immense public pressure, announced they were reopening the cold case of my parents' death. Thorne's carefully constructed image as a benevolent community leader shattered overnight. He was exposed as the predator he was. The legal battle was long and ugly. Thorne's lawyers threw everything they had at us. They tried to discredit the journalist, to intimidate the witness, to bury us in paperwork. But Vance was a master. He countered every move, his calm, methodical approach a perfect foil to their aggressive tactics. And the evidence was undeniable. The ledger, the photos, the tapes, they told a story that a jury couldn't ignore. The resolution wasn't a dramatic, movie-style courtroom victory. Thorne, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a long prison sentence, took a deal. He pleaded guilty to several counts of fraud and environmental violations. He avoided a murder charge. I couldn't quite make that stick beyond a reasonable doubt after so many years, but his empire was finished. Blackwood Development was forced into bankruptcy. Its assets seized to pay millions in fines and damages. Thorne himself received a 5-year prison sentence, a slap on the wrist for a lifetime of crime, but for us it was enough. His reign over the valley was over. The court validated my uncle's will. The Miller Ranch was officially, irrevocably mine. So was the trust fund, the $250,000 my uncle had so carefully saved. Felt surreal. The money wasn't a magical solution to all my problems. The scars of my past, of Carol's sacrifice, of my parents' murder, they were still there. But the money was a tool. It was a chance to rebuild. I used it to hire a local crew, men who had been put out of work by Blackwood's collapse, to help me restore the ranch. We fixed the roof on the main house, mended miles of fences, and cleared the overgrown pastures. We bought a small herd of cattle. Slowly, painstakingly, we brought the ranch back to life. Aunt Carol moved into the main house with me. We found a new rhythm, a quiet partnership. We were two broken people who, together, were becoming whole again. The house, once a mausoleum of sad memories, began to fill with new ones. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of our quiet conversations in the evening, the warmth from the stone fireplace on cold Montana nights. It became a home. Looking back, I realized the inheritance my uncle left me wasn't the 400 acres or the money in the bank. His true legacy was the truth. It was the story of my family's courage. It was the burden of responsibility and the gift of purpose. He gave me a reason to fight, a place to belong, and the key to unlocking the man I was always meant to be. He taught me that home isn't a place you are given. It's a place you build, a place you defend, a place you earn through love and sacrifice. So that's my story. It's a story about how the deepest betrayals can sometimes hide the fiercest love. It's about choosing to face the ghosts of the past instead of running from them, and realizing that your own strength is the one thing no one can ever take from you. If you've ever had to fight for your family, for your home, or just for the truth, I see you. This channel is for people like us, people who know that the most valuable things in life are the ones with the deepest scars. Subscribe if you believe in second chances. And in the comments below, I want you to tell me one thing. What's an inheritance worth fighting for? It doesn't have to be money or land. It can be a principle, a memory, a name. I'll be reading every single one, because your story, whatever it is, matters too. Thank you for listening.